Okay, we are going to talk about how to improve your chances of passing any interpreting exam now. And this is very helpful information because sometimes passing or failing an interpreting exam is just a matter of a few points. One of the major problems with candidates that take the exam, besides the fact that they are nervous, besides the fact of whatever, other external things that happen, one of the main things that actually happens with the candidates is that they are unaware on how to score points. It's an interpreting exam. The exam is trying to prove, or you're trying to prove that you can interpret, and that's your perception of it, which is not necessarily incorrect. But the exam is just really your opportunity to score the maximum number of points in a short period of time during the duration of that particular component. So you cannot be properly prepared to pass an interpreting exam, or any exam for that matter, if you don't understand how to score the points. In your mind, scoring points is either being perfect, knowing all the terms, having very wonderful or a wonderful intonation and all this style of delivery. But sometimes the truth of the matter is that scoring points is actually hitting the right key units. And when you take an interpreting exam, you need to know beforehand how you can score as many points as possible. Now, this is like equivalent to when you take a written test and you have 100 questions and you begin with the questions that you know so that you can score as many points as possible in the shorter period of time. However, in an interpreting exam, you cannot do that because you have to actually score as the material is coming to you. So, for example, say that you're doing a consecutive and you're interpreting now in the consecutive. The consecutive in most interpreting exams will last around 20 minutes. As you're doing the consecutive, you know that in all these consecutives there are a certain number of segments. You may have 10 segments or 15 segments in English and 15 segments in Spanish, or 20 in English and 20 in Spanish. The key for you will be to score as many points as necessary. Now, what does that mean, to score as many points as necessary to pass? Well, if the pass rate is 70%, you need to score that number of points, whatever 70% is. If it's 80%, you need to score that number of points. What is that 70%? What's 80%? Well, in all the exams, in all the components of your exam, there will be a maximum number of points that you can achieve at the end of the exam. And you need to score, of those maximum number of points, you need to score either a 70 or an 80%, 70 or 80% of them correctly. In your consecutive, for example, the number of points is going to be around 50. In your simultaneous, the number of points will be around 50, in some exams 40. In your sight, when it's English into Spanish, the number of points will be around 20 to 25. And in your sight, from Spanish into English, it will also be 20 to 25. So what it really means is that when you take your consecutive, that lasts 20 minutes, in a period of 20 minutes, there will be a total of 50 points. How are those points distributed? Are those points, if you have a consecutive that has 40 segments total, 20 in English, 20 in Spanish, are all of those 50 points in the first segment? And the answer is no. By proper exam practices, the number of points have to be distributed throughout those 40 segments. So what it means in terms of the exam itself is that you're not going to be able to get to, let's say, 70% of 50, 35 in the first 4 or 5 segments. You may need more segments. But when I say that the whole idea is to score the maximum number of points, the idea is to score the necessary number of points to pass the exam as soon as possible. What I'm referring to is score them as soon as you were exposed to that number of points. So if there are 40 segments, maybe by segment 29, if you did everything right, you already have the 70%. Now, it's important that you always try to score them as soon as possible for the following reason. It has been shown that students or candidates tend to perform better in long exams, like in the consecutive, that is 20 minutes, tend to perform better at the beginning than at the end. So it's important that we use that data to actually try to score as many points as possible. And when a new component comes in, let's say simultaneous, the same thing is true. Now, there are some candidates that don't do well at the very beginning of the exam, not the very beginning of the component. So if the exam begins with consecutive, maybe the first 4 or 5 segments you're weak, but then you should be able to recover and score and do fairly well. But in general, if given the opportunity, you should try to score them as soon as possible. What does it mean to you? It means that you need to be really ready for the exam from the moment that it begins, for that particular component. If you cannot, if you make mistakes at the beginning, you still have time or sufficient points available to reach that 70%. But what are these points? Because it's important to know, what do you mean by a point? Well, imagine that I create an exam for you, and that we both all of us create an exam together, and on this page I can put my whole consecutive, where I have one segment, another segment, another segment. So if you will have all 40 segments or so. In one of, do I have to have at least 1 point in each of the segments? That's the first question that you want to know. Because if you have 40 segments and there is a total of 50 points, common sense will say that each segment will have at least 1 point. The answer is not. That's not true. There could be questions with 0 points, and there could be answers with 0 points. But in general, the rule of designing exams indicate that the number of points have to be evenly distributed throughout the duration of that component. So you can say that on average basis, or you can go to the exam thinking that for each particular segment, you're going to have at least 1 point that you need to score. So it may or may not be true, but at least 1 point. Let's say that you have 40 segments in the consecutive, and there are 50 points. Clearly, there will be segments where there will be 2 points. Not too many, but there will be some segments where there will be 2 points. Okay, that's important, because I don't want you to expect, particularly in the simultaneous, I don't want you to think that all the points are accumulated at the end, in the middle, or at the beginning. It's evenly distributed. Now, next question. What is a point? Okay, is a point a word? It's a point a sentence? It's a point a factual information? Is a point a description? And if it is a description, is it just one item of that description or the whole description of an individual? And that's what we want to talk about today, so that you are better prepared for those particular key units and how to sort of detect where they are. That's important. Now, the question can tell you if the next segment will or will not include key units. The question may be able to tell you, and in most cases it will, whether or not the next segment, that is the answer, which is usually in Spanish, will or will not include a key unit, meaning include a point or even more than 1 point. If the question is descriptive, it requires an answer where you need to describe something, or explain something or somehow indicate what happened in a place, the probability of you getting 2 points in that segment is higher than anywhere else in the exam. So say that I'm a candidate and the question is, can you please tell me, sir, what actually happened when the police arrived at the scene of the crime? That question, of course, has to be delivered correctly, because in case there is a point in the question, which there could be, but I can tell you that the answer most likely will have at least 1 or 2 or even 3 points. What that means is that if you feel that you're not delivering the answer correctly, you must ask for a repetition for that segment, not for another segment that may not have that particular characteristic. So if I says, for example, where were you when that happened? Okay, that no description, right? Nothing that has to do with indicating what happened. Where were you? Oh, estaba en la parada del camión. That's it. All right, that may have at the most 1 point. So if you don't remember if it's camión or not camión, and you want to ask for a repetition, you can, but be aware that there will be at least 3 segments where there will be at least 2 points in each segment. This one is 1. Do I ask for a repetition, or do I just try to deliver as much as I can? Because if I do use one of my 2 repetitions, then when the long segment comes in and I don't get a repetition, I don't ask for a repetition, I may be missing more than 1 point or a fraction of that point that otherwise I would miss here without asking for the repetition. So the idea is that pay attention to the question, because the question will give you hints as to what is the value of the next segment. Now, some people say, well, the longer the segment, the more points. That could be true, but not necessarily. Because usually there is another rule in the exam making process that you cannot have too many key units next to each other in a given segment. So if I have a segment that has 40 words, I can have 3 key units in word number 1, 3, and 5. And then from word number 6 to 40, I don't have any key unit. I have to spread it evenly. But here's an interesting point. Is a key word or a point a single word or a phrase? Okay, if the keywords were single, if the key units were only single words, examiners can potentially could be forced to pass somebody who doesn't know how to interpret. How is that? Well, if my interpretation of that segment is completely omits a lot of portions of it, but if I hit the right word, if it's just a single word, if I hit the first word and I hit the 7th and I hit the word in placement number 12, word in placement number 20, and I don't hit anything in between, I can still get full credit for that segment. And technically, I could pass an exam without knowing how to interpret. So do not expect key units to be single words. That's why if you took an exam already and now you're taking it again, it's the same version, and you remember some of those words that you didn't know, yeah, they help perhaps, but they are not going to guarantee that you're going to pass that exam. Because at no time, generally, keywords or scoring units are not single words. What are scoring units? Well, the examiners or whoever designed the exam has to make sure that number 1, you have flow in the rendition in simultaneous. Number 2, in your consecutive, you can convey a message. Number 3, that message is conveyed in a way that grammatically is correct in the target language. Okay? When you put all this together, and we're talking about consecutive only, when you put all this together, what it means is that a scoring unit is going to be a sentence. And it's going to be a sentence that includes some tricks in grammar. And it's going to be a sentence that includes trick in grammar, which generally will be tenses. They want to know whether you respected past or present or future. So as a candidate, when you hear a segment, make sure you get the tense correct. Now, the other thing that they are going to look for in the syntax portion of that segment is your ability to restructure it in such a way that it sounds natural in the opposite language. Okay, that's important. Where do you think that comes in where do you think that's very important? In sight. Not necessarily in consecutive. In consecutive, the message usually tends to be very clear, and restructuring is unnecessary most of the time, except changing the order of the noun and the adjective and all that stuff. So that's not a big issue. So in consecutive, the technique to take the exam should be that technique that deals with accuracy. Why accuracy? Because if my consecutive, I have, let's say this is my segment, all right? And I'm just going to, these lines are words that create a message. Okay, so I have all these words that create a message. If I am going to take my consecutive in the exam, what I will do is I will make sure that I am very accurate in this message. Let's say that ends that one message. And why do I want to do that? Because I know that that could be a key word. Here's the ending of a message. There's a period. Another way to look at it, when there is a pause in the answer in your consecutive, that could mean either the ending or the beginning of a scoring unit. Do you understand that? That's really important. Huh? When there is a pause in the answer, that could mean the ending or the beginning of a scoring unit, because the scoring unit is going to be a partial message. What's an example of this? Let's do it in English. I was waiting for I was waiting for a taxi for over 3 hours when he came in and asked me and offered me a ride. I decided to wait for the taxi because I really don't trust the way he drives. So I have two messages there. Maybe the second one is a scoring unit or the first one. Rarely, both of them will. Rarely. Very rarely. What happens with candidates that miss the last portion of a consecutive is that generally I shouldn't say generally, but they have a high probability of missing scoring units. Because if I have a segment of 40 units, of 40 words, that those 40 words form a total of three messages or three sentences, I have a choice as an examiner. I can get the first one as the scoring unit, but I can the second and the third one, or I can get the second one. But I cannot get the first and the second or the second and the third. What I'm trying to say is that if you miss the last part of the original, and you know that the scoring, that particular segment will have two scoring units, and there are three messages, you know that the last sentence is going to be scoring unit, and the first one will as well. The probability of the scoring unit being at the beginning and at the end is much higher than anywhere else in the exam. So what does it mean to you as a candidate? Well, as a candidate, you need to somehow make sure that your delivery in consecutive is strong enough to your acquisition of the message in consecutive is strong enough to remember the first segment, the first sentence and the last segment of a segment. Now, it doesn't mean in the middle there won't be any, because if it's really long, you may be in a situation that there will be some. But it is not uncommon for you to have the beginning and the end as scoring units. So if I'm taking the exam and I have not asked for a single repetition, and I hear this long segment, and I know that the last portion of it is, I'm not remembering, I'm start delivering and I don't remember the last portion of it. Do not say, "Oh, what the hell with it. I don't want to use a repetition here." Do not do that, because most likely you have lost one scoring unit. And it's preferable to ask for the repetition, get the repetition, and when you get the repetition, you need to remember what you said and also concentrate on the last one, because in most interpreting exams, what stands is what you say at the second and last time. So if the first time you delivered the first three messages correctly and you forgot the fourth one, when you ask the repetition, for the repetition, whatever you're going to say next is what's going to stand. So you still have to remember the first three segments or three messages, and definitely try to remember as much as possible for that last segment, or last message, I should say. So where are you going to ask for a repetition? When the question tells you, or let me just back up a little bit here. Where are you going to concentrate the most in a consecutive? It should always be concentrated as much as you can, but even more concentration when the question calls for some type of testimony where the witness elaborates. That's step one. Step number two, that is going to be, the answer will be a candidate for a repetition, if you have to ask for it. Step number three, if I cannot recall the last portion of it, I ask for a repetition automatically in those segments. Now, hopefully, okay, there are three segments that are going to be long, and they give you 2 repetitions. So if you, and this is a wise way to use repetitions, you will not ask for a repetition when the segment is very short. Some people do, and it's fine, you know, if you feel you want to ask for a repetition, it's fine, but you're really not accumulating the maximum number of points that you could, simply because you're asking for a repetition. You're using one of your tools to gain maybe 1 point. It's preferable that you use one of your tools to gain at least 2 or 3 points. And that key unit or scoring unit will not be in a segment that is short. And it might be 1 scoring unit, but it won't be 2 or 3 or 4, simply because there has to be some time between a scoring unit and the next scoring unit in a segment. If it's too short, then there's going to be at the maximum 1 scoring unit. But if it's a long answer, the scoring units will be distributed, you know, accordingly. There shouldn't be more than 3 scoring units in a segment. Those long segments that in the exam usually there are 3, some exams they have 2. In the federal they have 2 long scoring, they are 70 words long. You may get 3 scoring units maximum, but on average basis, those long ones will have between 2 and 3. Sometimes you have 4, not at the state level, but at the federal level. So, having said that, what is the plan when you go and take the consecutive? Well, you have to be smart about this. Of course, you have to render everything. Of course, you have to be perfect. That's a given. But what's more important is about thinking scoring units. And a scoring unit means, the first question is, okay, I'm giving 2 tools here, 2 repetitions. When am I going to use one and when am I going to use the other one? Use those when the answer that is given to you is long, which makes sense. Or use one when the answer is sort of medium, but you miss the last portion of it. And when are you going to, for what segments are you going to really concentrate as much as you can? For those segments where the question calls for an answer that will require some type of, this will require the witness to elaborate and basically explain. Now we're going to look at what is a scoring unit per se. All right, and that's important to keep in mind. What is a scoring unit? Do I have the? Do I have? Okay, that's fine. Okay. For example, what is a scoring unit? This is so appropriate because that's exactly what I'm going to talk about. So let me just put it right here. Okay. So what is a typical scoring unit? Okay. Is it plugged in? There you go. What is a typical scoring unit? All right. So let's go over this one. In consecutive, for example. Scoring units will be, scoring units will be factual information. Oops, what happened here? Oops, I don't know what happened here. 1 second, please. Okay. This thing is not behaving. Okay, scoring units will be factual information. I don't know, I have some technical problem. Okay, here we go. Is it working now? Let's see. Okay, all right. So scoring units will be factual information. That's a given. But wait a minute, what do you mean by that? Does it mean that if the answer is, I live at 123 North Main, 123 is a scoring unit, North is another one, and Main is another one? No, it's the whole address. Okay, what about if I have names like Jose, Alberto, Roberto, y Maria? Does it mean that each one will be a scoring unit? No, you can't have one next to the other. This will be a scoring unit. So what about if I miss Alberto and I miss Maria? Okay, you get 0.5 out of 1. Because each one is 0.25. So what should I ask for a repetition? It's up to you. If you ask for a repetition when there is factual information and the segment is short, you may gain at the most the more, I mean, in a sequence of names, you may lose anywhere between 0.25. I'm sure you're going to remember 1 out of 4 at least, or 2 out of 4. Somebody who has been trained will remember at least 2 names out of 4. So you lose only half a point. Do you want to use your repetition to gain half a point, knowing that later on there might be a segment where there could be 3 points? No, you won't. So in those cases, you let it go. And don't start thinking, oh, I forgot the name here, I forgot there. It's irrelevant. Try to say as many as you can, but let it go. Don't ask for a repetition in a segment like that. If the answer is, for example, yeah, I was there with Jose, Alberto, Roberto, and Maria. That's not long enough to actually even call for a repetition. And you only remember 2 of those. Just deliver 2, but keep your repetition for future usage. Now, some candidates, what they do is they don't ask for a repetition in segments like this, and then they completely forget that some tough segments are coming, and they don't ask for repetition for those segments either. You're given 2 tools. You got to use them before you end the exam. And you have to use them at the right time. Because it will serve no purpose if you don't ask for a repetition here, but then when it just comes to, if you don't ask for a repetition in this situation with Jose, Alberto, Roberto, Maria, and then you decide not to ask for a repetition in the long segment, it will absolutely serve no purpose. So you have to be wise about how to use your repetition. Okay, it's very important. What other thing is considered to be key units? Key units could be, okay, basically factual information, areas where you will be exposed to false cognates. What do you mean false cognates? Well, most likely you will see that in the question. And in the question, there could be words such as the court, right? Probation, if it's technical. They don't have to be technical words. They could be general words. Maybe discuss, used in a way that you cannot use discutir, but rather hablar, platicar, mencionar. Maybe that's there as well. This, unfortunately, if you constantly use false cognates, this you will not even notice. But those of you that don't have problems with false cognate, pay attention to those and deliver that false cognate, or that what appears to be a false cognate, or could be a false cognate, or that word that may generate a delivery that is a false cognate. Do that and pay very close attention to it, because that's going to be part of the key unit. But it may not be only the false cognate, the key unit. It might be the whole thing. So, for example, in an answer, let me just give you an answer. It's harder to see the false cognate play from Spanish into English. Usually it's from English into Spanish. So let's see if we can put it in a question. If it says, for example, did you discuss the matter with defense counsel before coming to court? Well, I can tell you that in this particular question, the whole thing is a key unit. How do I know that? I know that discuss is a potential false cognate and court is a potential false cognate. And I know the segment is short enough that I can't have two key units in that segment. So what are they going to do? They're going to get the whole segment as a key unit. So what about if I deliver discuss and I deliver incorrectly court? If I say corte instead of juzgado, tribunal, or the other way around, well, then you're going to get half a point for that instead of 1. What about the other words that are there? The other words are important, but in each key unit, there are predominant words or predominant concepts. If the examiner's purpose is to check your false cognates, and that's why they put that segment there, they're going to be looking for those false cognates, even though the whole thing is a key unit. So maybe the false cognates are worth it 0.4945 points, and the remaining words there is just only 0.1. You got to hit the false cognates. So what it tells you is that if you hear a question with a word in English that potentially could be a false cognate in Spanish, even if you don't remember the whole question, please say the false cognates. Or not the false, the proper one, right? But discuss, hablar, platicar, court, tribunal. So even if you sound, for example, usted platicó tribunal, and you miss, for example, eso con su abogado antes de venir, you probably score 90% of that score unit. But if you concentrate on eso con el abogado antes de venir, and you deliver that, that can only be worth at 0.1 point. And if you forget court at the end, then you already lost 0.45 points. So identify questions where there are false cognates, that are potential false cognates, and when you identify them, when you hear them, and I want you to start doing this in the practices now, in this second part of the course. When you identify a question that includes potential false cognates, even if you don't remember the whole question, you will deliver the false cognates. Even if you leave spaces blank and it sounds odd, you will deliver the false cognate. All right? Is that? But not in false cognate. Use the proper cognate, right? The good cognate. Now, what else could be a key unit? Anything that has to do with grammar. And what's an example of it? Expressions. In bad faith, for example. Why is it there? Well, they want to know whether you say en mala fe instead of de mala fe. Mala fe. So that's there. Idiomatic expressions, to actually see whether you transfer them linguistically, word for word, or you transfer the concept. That's important. So if I'm taking my consecutive and I hear an idiomatic expression, usually it could be in English or it could be in Spanish. When I hear an idiomatic expression, if I know what it means, but I don't know the equivalent one, please explain the meaning of it. If you hear, for example, it is raining cats and dogs, and you don't remember llueve a cántaros, and you decide to say llueve mucho, do that. You're going to get partial credit. It's preferable than skipping it. So idiomatic expression space. So far, what do we have as very important? Factual information. Words in English that could produce a false cognate in Spanish. Idiomatic expressions. Phrases in English that may not carry out the same preposition. In light of, a la luz de, no en la luz de, for example. What else could it be? Things that denote this, that refer to descriptions of an individual. So description is important. What do you mean by description? Well, if the question is, could you tell us what he was wearing when he committed that crime? That's an important segment. And most likely there will be a list of things, but because they cannot have two scoring units too close to each other, if I'm as a candidate, the answer is, for example, well, he was wearing a black jacket, blue pants, a shirt, a white shirt, and he had a belt, a black belt. Okay, so we have all those 4 elements. And that's the end of it, because it's a short segment. All those 4 will be worth at 1 point. So it's like in the case of names. If you miss one, then it's 0.25. So it's okay if you miss one. You probably won't miss too much in terms of scoring points, but at least you got 3/4 of it, 0.75. So because the question is whether you should ask for a repetition or not. And in a segment like that, maybe not, because the bottom line is that that whole thing is a key unit, so that's worth it 1 point. So you just remove, you just try to score, because now it's scoring within that point. How much can you score? Okay, it's divided into 0.25 each, score as many as you can. It's different than in a long segment where you may have 3 sentences somehow separated from each other, where you have 3 key units there, and therefore that's worth it now 3 points. That's way more than 0.25 points. And at the end of the day, 1 point can make you fail or pass. 1 point. If you score 68%, look, 1 point is 2% of 50. 2% of 50 is 1, right? So if you score 68 in your exam, in your consecutive, it's because you missed 1 point. If you score 66, you miss 2 points. If you score 64, you miss 3 points, and so on and so forth. Of course, if you miss 10, then that's going to cost you a lot, because you're probably going to get way less than that, less than 60 actually. So people that score between 60 and 70, it's just a difference of 5 scoring units. And it doesn't mean that you don't know the scoring unit, but it could mean that you didn't pay attention. You didn't know where the scoring unit is, or you couldn't identify it, and therefore you couldn't say it. So that's important. Items that have to do with position. For example, I arrived home and I put my keys on the table, and then I went to the kitchen and prepared a sandwich, and then I went to watch TV. That has to do position of what? Of an individual. Okay? At a table first, kitchen, living room to watch TV. That's important. Anything that deals with position is important. Position of what? What do you mean by position? Things that happen in different rooms, another way to look at it. Things that happen in different locations. That's important. What's the other thing that could be a scoring unit? Anything where the participants change. So if I'm talking about I, and then I talk about the police, and then I talk about John, you can be sure that almost certain, if it's a segment of about 30 words or so, you're probably going to have 3 scoring units, 1 for each of us. That's why the technique that I teach you, where you do those domains and you put different things, is so important, because that guarantees that you're going to at least get the scoring unit for each of these particular participants. Because the problem, what they're trying to see is, if there is information about I, and information about the police, and information about John, is the candidate able to put that information in for the right participant? Because it's possible, when you take notes without any type of idea whatsoever, just one word below the other, it's possible that the information that pertains to I, you actually explain it or say it for John, and the one for John for the police. It's possible. That will really be bad, because right there, if you change positions, you got a 0. No matter if you got the key unit correct, but if you change the position, in other words, if you deliver everything correctly, but you make the wrong participant do that action, you got a 0. So that's something you need to be careful when we do the practices. From now on, the practice that I'll do in consecutive will include these key units, so that you are, and I will stop the tape, and I will tell you, okay, you tell me which one is the key unit in the next segment. What do you expect? I want you to start predicting them. That's one of the main things that you can do, because you're all ready to pass the exam. And yes, you're going to be nervous and all that stuff, but you may not know where to score sufficient point. I see endless number of people that when they don't pass the exam, in most instances, they score anywhere between 64 and 68, 69. That's so easy to improve if you pay attention to the scoring unit, the process that is followed for the scoring units. And then you have general okay, we have also markers and intensifiers. If I see something that says, for example, I was very, very, very upset, and you transfer it into the opposite language, I was very upset. That's a mark, that's an intensifier. You didn't transfer it 3 times, you get a 0. There's no partial credit for it. Because the expectation is that you say very, very, very 3 times. If you said it once, that's it. So the way that they grade you on that scoring unit is not on how many of those 3 you got right, because it's the same word anyway. They grade you on whether you kept the intensity of the original. So it's important that when somebody emphasizes something in the original, you make sure you emphasize that. In terms of note-taking, the emphasizing this thing, this exclamation point is extremely important to denote that there is something emphasized that you have to emphasize, okay? We will work on this as well. Now, and then of course we have general vocabulary and grammar and all that. Is there legal vocabulary in the consecutive? Not that much, maybe 1 scoring unit legal. Which are the, and of course, is there slang? Yeah, there are some slangs. Maybe how many slangs in the consecutive? 2, maybe. So 1 legal in consecutive, 2 slang. What else? Maybe 2 false cognates. Okay, 2 false cognates. What else could it be? Well, what is the rest? The rest is factual. The rest is general vocabulary. The rest is grammar. And the rest is idiomatic expressions. Sometimes you take the consecutive and you say, this is fine, thank you. Sometimes you take the consecutive, somehow it's interfering with my computer. Oh, I know why, because okay. Sometimes you take the consecutive and you say, okay, all I have to do is deliver everything perfectly. Not necessarily. You have to deliver, what has to be perfect is anything that deals with scoring units, not everything, okay? And that's extremely important. Let's see if I can go back to this. Give me a second, please. All right, any questions on how this actually works in consecutive? Yes?
When you mentioned that we asked for a repetition even after we've already started interpreting, but we realized we forgot a part of it. So we're in the middle of already the rendition.
The question is, can you ask for a repetition after you began the rendition? It depends on the rules of the interpreting exam. Some allow them, some do not. But it really doesn't matter. Even if it doesn't allow it, you'll know that if you're missing. I will ask for a repetition. If I deliver the beginning and I know I forgot the end, I will ask for a repetition anyway. If they give it to me, that's fine. If they don't, I know that in some time ago in the federal exam, you had to ask for a repetition before rendering it. But in the state exams, they do allow you to, I believe. I don't know. You have to check in the instructions when they give you the instructions. Yeah.
It doesn't say. At the practice that we took last week, what happens to me is that the time of the repetition, it wasn't enough for me.
The question is the time of the rendition, the pause.
Yeah, when they give me
No, in the exam, it's different here than in the exam. Here is pre-recorded, so we calculate an approximate pause. In the exam, there is a proctor. They wait for you. When you finish, then they press the next segment. So you will have no issue with that. But they do take a look at, in the state. In the federal exam, it's timed. You have to deliver the consecutive within a period of time. And if you didn't, it stops there, and whatever you didn't deliver is considered wrong. So in the state exam, they look mainly at how long it takes you to begin the rendition. Shouldn't be more than 3 seconds. They don't want you to be writing everything until the end, the last portion of it. So how do you always remember? What can you do to remember the last portion of a consecutive? Always write the last word. It almost always works. Question before we move on to the simultaneous. The next ones are much easier. Yes.
How many segments do you
How many segments? The consecutive will last around 20 to 22 minutes, and that means that you could get anywhere between 30 and 50 segments. It depends on the version of the exam and the speed at which it is recorded. Now, let's move on to simultaneous. So consecutive, of all these techniques, which one is the most critical for the, if we were to put some weight into these techniques, which one is more important? Is it consecutive, is it simultaneous, or is it sight? We know that sight is the least important of all. Why? Because we don't do those that often. And to be honest with you, or to be truthful to you, sight in real life, it's all pretty much forms that you know them by heart, like the material you do in Criminal 2 here. So they are not too, many, many years ago, I knew that the distribution, I don't know if it's still the same, for the state of California was 40% consecutive, 40% simultaneous, 20% sight. Both sides. So it's 10 and 10 only. But it doesn't mean anything because in California you have to pass all of them anyway. But from a subjective point of view, making a mistake in sight should not be as critical as making a mistake in a consecutive. And between consecutive and simultaneous, consecutive is more important because that's what goes on the record. Your simultaneous doesn't go on a record. It goes to the defendant who speaks a language other than English. So as a result of it, if you want to put weights on each component, but it doesn't matter to you, you have to pass all of them. Now in simultaneous is basically a block. How long does it last? 4 minutes, all right? 4 minutes, right? 4 minutes. And what's the speed of it? 120 words per minute. Yeah, let me have it. It might be a little too preferred. Yeah, good, thank you. Yeah, it's always the same, actually. So how many words do you think are used in a 4-minute simultaneous if the speed is 120 per minute? There are 480 words. But I told you that the number of key scoring units is only 50. So are you telling me that, obviously if you were to think this way, scoring unit is just a single word, they're only grading you only on about 10% of all the words that are said in the simultaneous. So technically, if they consider scoring unit a single word, then they will be saying, look, if you hit them right, if they are single words, you can pass an interpreter that basically says, I, court, yesterday, arraignment, maybe, I don't know if those are scoring units, but there's no message. So the scoring unit in simultaneous tends to be longer than in consecutive. And what that means is that when the scoring unit is longer, it means that missing a word is less important in the scheme of things. Because if I have to divide 1 point in a total of 10 words, then each word is 0.1. So if I miss 3, well, I still get 0.7. And I want 0.7 is what I want in every single segment for the state of California, because that's 70%. So one of the things that I notice is that candidates, when they take this, or students rather, when they are doing these mock exams and that we do here with the one-on-one and all that, they get so nervous when they don't know a word, which probably cost them 0.1 point out of 50, that they don't let their mind continue with their rendition and try to continue scoring points. Because they're still thinking about that one, or they think that, I fail already. So for 0.1, you're risking 49.9 points. Isn't that stupid or what? So what's the solution to this? The solution is not to think. Yeah, it is a skip the word. You skip the word, no doubt about it. But do not think about that word once you skip it. Incidentally, in consecutive, if you don't know a word, and I think we've discussed this already, you leave the word in the original language. Because there is also a section in consecutive that deals with your retention. And it is more in the subjective portion of it, because the bottom line is that if you miss part of that segment that is considered to be a scoring unit, you're going to be paying a price anyway. But it's also affects the subjective portion. What is the subjective portion of the exam? What the examiners think of you as an interpreter, as an overall interpreter. So leaving the term in the original language in consecutive is the way to go, because you're telling the examiner you won't get if there is a deduction of 0.25 for that, you're going to get the deduction. But at least it won't affect the subjective portion, because you're telling the examiners, I don't know the word, but I remember the original, so my technique is okay. In simultaneous, when you don't know a word, you skip the word. Because if you look, simultaneous is always coming from somebody, from the interpreter, to someone who speaks other than English. So why would you want to tell that person something in English? So in the exam, they penalize you in the subjective portion. They penalize you for mixing languages. So the rule in simultaneous, skip terms. Now, how do they, what are the way that they determine what scoring units are in simultaneous is easier than in consecutive, because they have 4 minutes and they can say, okay, we're going to, take a scoring unit now, then wait maybe 20 seconds, another scoring unit, maybe less, 10 seconds, another scoring unit, because it has to be distributed, evenly distributed in the exam. But however, in the simultaneous, you may get the first scoring unit may have 20 terms, and the second one may have only 5 terms. So that we don't know. It's unknown. We don't know. It's up to them. Generally, the length of the scoring unit in a simultaneous does not coincide with the sentence. You can have a long segment like this, and the scoring unit is just in the middle. But that scoring unit already includes like 7 or 8 words. So we have no way of knowing. But what we do know is that in simultaneous, here is the key thing. Legal, these are the main ones. Legal terms, legal phrases, and trust me, and general vocabulary. Now it depends on the exam. These are the main ones.
How about when they give like the numbers, is it like
No, then the question is number, factual information. Factual information is important, but it's not the main ones. You may have one only. In fact, most interpreters that have been interpreting for the longest time, they still have problems with the numbers. It's not unusual. So even the examiners have problems with numbers. But these 3 things are important. Now, let me explain how this works. Most interpreting exams are not just one version. They have 3 versions. There could be one version where general vocabulary is predominant. There could be one version where legal terms are predominant. There could be one version where legal phrases are predominant. You will know as soon as you take the exam, as soon as you start with it. If it's an opening or closing, expect general vocabulary to be predominant. If it is a conversation between a judge and the court, then it could be either legal terms or legal phrases. These are the things that you shouldn't really miss. Now, legal terms, legal phrases, you're trained for that, but general vocabulary sometimes is difficult. They may come across, or sometimes some idiomatic expressions. They may throw at you things that are a little bit too complex, or you understand the meaning, but you don't know how to say it in the opposite language, and you have to react in a second. Please, if you don't know the exact interpretation of a word from English into the target language, but you know what it means, explain it, if you can. Explain it. There is sort of partial credit for that. And it could be enough to actually make you pass the exam. Now, but don't explain it if you know that you're going to be missing the words that come afterwards. So the explanation should be a second. So what can you do with this type of practice? When you go to your lab, for example, don't necessarily interpret it simultaneous. You have a lot of simultaneous practices for this class. Just play a simultaneous, listen to the simultaneous, and as soon as you, in your mind, identify the words that you don't know, and try to that you don't know how to say it in the opposite language, but that you understand them in the original language. Try to explain what it means and see whether you can continue with the next word. At 120, you will have time. At 160, you won't. The exam is around 120, 125. It's important to train you on that. We will do that in this last portion of the course as well. Then, of course, we have the issue with syntax. Is syntax important here? Unless it changes the meaning, it's not important in simultaneous because of the nature of the technique. It's really difficult for you to keep good grammar in a transfer word for, using the simultaneous. But if the syntax is such that you change the meaning of the original, you got a real problem. So what do you mean by that? Well, sometimes using the wrong preposition could be a problem. For example, if I say, I'm not in my desk versus I'm not at my desk. In your desk, I hope you're not in your desk. You're at your desk. In your desk, you're inside a drawer. Where are you? So the same thing happens in Spanish, right? So the transfer is important. So that's important, okay? That's something to keep in mind. And the simultaneous is one of those techniques where you can be thinking, oh, is that a key unit or not? Simultaneous, I always tell students, you got to be really prepared for it. Just go for it. The only thing that you should be concerned in simultaneous is that if you don't know a word, you skip it and you don't think about it. That's the answer to this one. I can't really, in consecutive, you have time to think because you receive the question and you know more or less what the answer is going to be or what the answer should be. Now, in sight, on the other hand, that one is like consecutive. You have sufficient time. In fact, you read the sight for a period of time, 2 minutes generally. And in sight, you do have sufficient time to restructure. Sight is one of those components where or the only component, I should say, where the examiners check your syntax in both languages. If you have issues in Spanish, they are going to get you in sight. If you have issues in English, they are going to get you in sight. It is the purpose of the sight translation component in most interpreting exams is to see how well this person structures the rendition to determine how proficient that individual is in the target language. This one is, and on top of that, they may throw at you, so they're called distractors. The purpose is the grammar more than anything else. Of course, you have to convey the meaning and all that stuff. But the grammar is the main thing there. That's the one that is going to disqualify you. If they notice that your grammar is not good in the target language, they're going to fail that side even if you said all the words. Now, if your grammar is okay and you don't know all the words, you will still pass. That's why sometimes students come to me and say, I don't even know how I passed this site. I didn't know most of the words. Yeah, but whatever you said was properly structured. And then the opposite is true. I don't know how I cannot pass this site. I knew all the words. Yeah, but maybe you structured them incorrectly. So sight is a component where you have to be accurate, you have to deliver the message, but most important of all, you have to be able to structure in such a way that you show them that you're using the proper prepositions, you're putting things in the right place, you don't start a sentence in Spanish with a gerund if at all possible. Those details are critical. Now, the message is important, and the message in sight usually is a high register. One is not, the other one is. But not too high, but it uses words that are legal. So many sites from Spanish into English or English into Spanish will include legal terms. So the key units will always be those units where syntax is predominant. So I look at a site in the original language, in English, and I see, for example, reviewing the document led us to believe that. I know that's a key unit automatically, because I know that in Spanish, if you say estudiando o analizando el documento is wrong, and because sight concentrates on the syntax, that is a key unit. So I have to make sure that I deliver that correctly. For example, if I see a sight translation where it has a lot of verbs and then the proper noun or the subject at the end, like presentándose en este juzgado, coma, indicando para las actas lo que sucedió, coma, indicando que quiere la patria potestad del acusado, de los niños, coma, está el señor José Pérez. I know that the whole thing is going to be a key structure. So that's because I know that that's a grammatical thing. And the same thing in English when you transfer that into the opposite language. So for sight, which incidentally we're going to start working on doing reviews on site next week as well. But you should come to the site class. I'm giving you really good sites, additional sites that they're excellent because they have all these tricks. For site, it's important that you have your syntax right, and you know your, I don't know if I should say you know your word. It's not that important to know what patria potestad is necessarily. It's much more important in that segment to make sure that you put the subject first. It's way more important than knowing what that patria potestad, which is custody of the minors, de los menores, what it is. So yes, concentrate on vocabulary. The advice that I have for you is when you're reading the site, if you don't know a word, a given word, look at the sentence and see whether you can still deliver the sentence grammatically correct, even though you don't know the word. If that's the case, don't pay any more attention to the word. Just move on to the next part of the site. Because the whole purpose of that site is grammar, the transfer of syntax. So if I don't know patria potestad in this segment, I'm not going to be spending, at least 20, 30 seconds of my time trying to find out what patria potestad is in my mind. What I will do, however, is I will say, okay, how can I put this correctly in the opposite language? And when it comes to the word patria potestad, I will probably leave it in the original language so that they know that I'm placing it in the right place in terms of grammar. All right, any questions on this? Yes? The question is, if you hear in the simultaneous a word that it is actually a Latin word, like ex parte, do you actually transfer that into Spanish as ex parte? Can you do that? And the answer is no. Believe it or not, even though English is not based on Latin, basically, doesn't come from Latin, there are many more legal words in Latin in English than in Spanish. In Spanish, we don't use Latin that much in the legal area. We use the corresponding translation. So ex parte will be a instancia de parte. Any other one? Okay, so is this helpful? Yes. Okay. So now you have to think about what I just said and create a plan now. And what is your plan? Okay, from now on, next week when you come to the practices will address every single thing that I said. And just try to score as many units as you can. And your second evaluation, the one-on-one that you're going to have with the evaluators here, will specifically address these issues. So next time, the next evaluation, they will tell you how many points you got correctly, and you need to actually show them that you know where the points are, that you thought about this. So the best way is, okay, you understand all this, but you have to go back to any practice now in the lab, a consecutive, and listen to it and try to figure out where the key units are. That's what you should do. Go to any site, read the original site, and say, okay, this is probably a key unit, this is probably a key unit, this is probably a key unit, because this has to do with Syntek, transfer of syntactical transfer. You do a simultaneous, you listen to a simultaneous, and those are difficult, much more difficult to predict. But at least you know that if it's general vocabulary, legal phrases, legal vocabulary, so identify. When I say general vocabulary, it's not going to be table. It's going to be vocabulary that you know what it means, but you don't know how to say it in the opposite language. So identify that. Because you can never be successful in passing the exam unless you're really are lucky and score all the units. But you can never be successful if you don't understand how to score those units. And you will not understand how to score. I mean, now you probably understand, but you have to now be familiar with the way the exams are actually prepared, so that particularly in the consecutive and in sight, you can predict whether or not the next segment you're going to say, you're going to interpret, happens to include a key scoring unit. And that's really the lesson to be learned. Any questions? Yes, sir.
The correct translation for this that you mentioned, reviewing the documents led us to believe that this or that.
Reviewing the documents led us to believe whatever. The key here, the key is that you don't want to say analizando los documentos. Al analizar los documentos, nos pareció o nos parece que blah, blah, blah. But the key is this one, because the rule is if a sentence begins, It's a verb. A sentence begins with a verb in gerund. In English, in Spanish, it has to be in infinitive form. It has to end with ar, er, o ir. Question?
What was the website that we played this over again? Exactly that we played.
I'll tell you later. That website. Okay. So this ends.